we have these people, Coneheads, people like Akhenaten and Nefertiti. They lived and reigned in the mid-1300 BC time frame, and of course, got to remember, the Egyptians came from Mitzrayim, which is the son of Ham. Now, this isn't just a cool hat she's wearing. She's covering up one heck of a dome of a head. She's a conehead, and they had conehead children. We have various busts and depictions of their children, like you got the little happy conehead kids on the lap of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. These people were coneheads. So, if Nephilim can reproduce, and if there are female Nephilim, that's a game changer, guys. There's no need for multiple incursions in this scenario. Again, all of this is genetic carryover, in my opinion. And we have all kinds of evidence of, strange coneheads out there, and I'm just going to go ahead and say that they were Nephilim. I have Nephilim skulls with a question mark here, and, people speculate and they wonder, and they're trying to get all the scientific data to figure out what's the deal with these people. I'm just going to come right out and say it's my opinion, and take it for what it's worth, that these were, in fact, Nephilim. This was a skull found in, this was an article from December 18th, 2012, and the headline for this said, "The incredible alien skull discovered in a Mexican cemetery, 1,000-year-old skeleton." And it said, "Archaeologists in Mexico today revealed the astonishing skull of a person suffering from a cranial disfiguration." Yeah, you could say so. That's a major conehead going on right there. Now, some say that this is just the result of cranial headboarding, where you strap boards to the baby's head, and as the child is growing, the boards keep the skull in a certain shape, and it starts to elongate and turn into a conehead. But first of all, you have to wonder, why are they doing this in the first place? What prompts parents to take their baby and say, hey honey, let's strap boards to the kid's head so we turn them into a conehead? Like, why would they do that? Myself, Elliot Marzulli, and others would contend that they're emulating something, that there were people born this way. There were probably people in positions of royalty, in leadership, and they were emulating them. They were wanting to be like them. And as proof that there are people born this way, that not all of them are the result of cranial headboarding, there was a fetus found in the mummified remains of a pregnant woman. And Childress and Forster wrote about this in their book Enigma of Cranial Deformation. They wrote, "Two crania, both of children scarcely a year old, had in all respects the same form as those of adults. The same formation of the head presents itself in children yet unborn. And of this truth we have had convincing proof in sight of a fetus enclosed in the womb of a mummy of a pregnant woman, aged 7 months." So they found a 7-month-old fetus in the mummified remains of a pregnant woman, and this is what the artist drew. It looks like, something from the movie Alien, right? This is a conehead baby that had not yet been born. So that proves that not all the coneheads were the result of people strapping boards to their heads, but that there are actually, the reason they're doing that is because people were naturally born this way. And L.A. Marzulli has done a lot of great work on this in his Trail of the Nephilim series, and he's done several trips down to Peru. Highly recommend you check out his resources in that regard. A lot of good stuff there. This is what I call the Home Alone baby. Oh no, I've got a conehead. This is a mummy of a child with obviously a very large conehead going on there. And just spend some time looking into the Conehead skulls. You'll see stuff like this. Very large skulls, some with as much as 40% more cranial capacity. If you could strap boards to a baby's head, but it's not going to increase the brain case. In other words, the space where the brain is not going to get enlarged. All you're going to do is change the shape of the skull. You're just going to change the shape of the case. It's not going to increase the case by as much as 40%. Like, maybe this skull right here. This is a artist's rendition of what this person may have looked like. Now, when I was doing my research for all this, and even before I think LA's first trip to Peru, I got a call from a friend of mine, Jeff Randall, calls me up and says, and I hadn't seen the guy in like 5 years, I think, at that point. I met him when I first moved here when I first moved down to Texas in 2003, but then he moved to New York, and I hadn't seen or heard from him in like 5 years, I think it was. And anyway, he was coming back to Dallas, and he called me up and said, "Hey, listen, man, I'm going to be back in town. I'd love to meet with you." And I said, sure. So we went out to eat at Cracker Barrel, and while we're there, he presents me with a replica of a skull from Peru. That apparently he knew a woman who had access to one of the Conehead skulls, or several of the Conehead skulls in Peru, and she or somebody took a cast of the skull and made, a really detailed replica, exact replica of the skull. And he said, I've been following your work. I've seen a lot of your Nephilim research, and I figured, maybe this could help you with your research, and I want you to have it. And I'm like, dude, seriously? Yeah, man, this is awesome. So he gave me this. This is actually the skull that's on the cover of the book that Childress and Forrester put it out, The Enigma of Cranial Deformation. And so, this is just white plastic, and I went and painted it so it looked more like an old skull that you might dig up. And so, and then I eventually got a replica of a male skull also. And this particular one had trepanation there, where they drill a hole in the skull. You've heard the phrase, "Yeah, I need that like a hole in the head." That goes back to the practice that people did, and people don't even know exactly why they did it. Where they were drilling holes in people's heads. And this particular skull shows evidence that he survived the surgery because there's evidence of healing as a result of this this surgery, that healing had taken place there, scar tissue and whatnot. So anyway, so now I have replicas of two Conehead skulls, a male and a female, from Peru. And my friend Dr. Judd Burton came to town, and I showed him the skull, and I said, in your professional opinion, can you give me an analysis of this skull? And so the video I'm about to show you is of him holding my skull and giving an analysis of it. And then he later went down to Peru with L.A. Marzulli, so I've got clips of L.A. talking about some of the skulls that they found down there, and his thoughts on all that. So check this out.
The suture patterns in this skull are off. This one lacks the separation that you would find in a normal human skull. On the top here, there should be a suture here. There's not one. The sutures, of course, are the basically the interlocking joints that you would find in a skull. What I notice here also is that while this looks on the surface to be cranial deformation, it seems to me that there's more cranial capacity. Of course, without having done the anthropometry on the skull myself, but there's more cranial capacity here. It's not as pronounced in skulls such as the Chongo skulls from Ica, which have very high vaulted domes, and you can visibly see that you're looking at probably about 25%, but you're definitely looking at a skull here that displays some anomalous features. And there is an extra foramen in the back of the skull, and you would probably have to zoom in to find it. But this is probably a foramen. It could be, I suppose it could be trepanation, but this is probably another foramen, which is one of the things that I noticed on a number of the skulls in a Paracas collection. And my question was, what is this doing here? Well, there are a number of reasons. It could be carrying extra blood supply to the brain. There could be additional nerve bundles that would attach in some way to the vertebral column. But there's something going on in the skull morphologically that goes beyond simple cranial deformation.
Rob Skiba's skull, I believe, I haven't vetted this, and I asked Rob where he got it, that could be a replica of this skull, because that's pretty much what the Chongo skull looked like when we went into the museum to take pictures. This is my photograph at the ICA Museum in Peru, where this guy was. What's interesting is they're all over the place down there. And the Peruvian government just released a book about them, but there still has been no DNA testing on that, except for the DNA testing that was done through Brian Forrester and Lloyd Pye, through Lloyd Pye's genetics, which was done a couple of years ago, which was just released a couple of weeks ago, which went viral. Here's a shot of one of the skulls from Paracas. There's not a hint of a parietal suture. What we should see, called a sagittal suture, we should see a sagittal suture running like this, which separates the two parietal plates. It's not there, not even a hint of it. And when you look inside the skull, there's not a hint of it in the inside of the skull either. So the skull, it hasn't fused over age. Something is going on here. Here's a side shot of another skull. This is the one that we cast. Look at this skull. This is called Waki. It stood about this tall. You think that's normal? I don't. Let me just show you some things. Look at this one with the suture going and splitting the two frontal plates. That's not supposed to be there. That frontal plate's supposed to be intact. It's not supposed to have a suture in it. The suture goes up like this, and then the sagittal suture goes back. These skulls are anomalous. There's a Chongo skull. No sagittal suture. This is what some of these guys, according to Marco Plume, may have looked like. He paints them a little too benevolent for my taste. You know, why they're not beating a door down to Peru is beyond me. I don't get it. I mean, I'm mystified by it. So let's move on. Here's a normal human skull on the right, an Inca human skull. And this guy here, of course, is a Paracas skull, much larger. Some people want to say that this is the result of cradle headboarding, and I understand what cradle headboarding is. And cradle headboarding is this: when you tie material to a child's skull and you shape the head. But shaping the skull is not going to create a greater cranial capacity in the inside of the skull. It's still going to have the same amount of space in the skull as a normal human skull. Guess what? The ones in Paracas are 25 to 30% greater in capacity than a normal human skull. I'm not making this up. We've had it verified. Aaron Junkins and Amatrell Nephilim 2 is writing up a paper. We spent hours measuring and looking at all the skulls. So something is going on. And it begs the question, why does a culture get up on a Monday morning and go, I think I'm going to make my son have a conehead. That's what I want my boy to be. Yes, sir. Come here, Freddie. You're going to be a conehead when you grow up. It's like, what? This is Judd Burton going, huh? About 6 of these skulls are not cradle headboarded. And we believe that they're the real thing. Plus, what is red hair doing in Peru? This is the DNA testing results which came out. It went viral a couple of weeks ago on the web. Brian released it. And this is what it says. This is from a geneticist whom I have spoken to. Whatever the sample labeled 3A has come from, it had mitochondrial DNA with mutations unknown in any human, primate, or animal known so far. The data is very sketchy, though, and a lot of sequencing still needs to be done to recover the complete mitochondrial DNA sequence. But a few fragments I was able to sequence from this sample 3A indicate that if these mutations will hold, we are dealing with a new human-like creature, very distant from Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, and Denisovans. I am not sure it will even fit into the known evolutionary tree. The question is, if they were so different, they could not interbreed with humans. Breeding within their small population, they may have degenerated due to inbreeding. That would explain buried children. They were either low or not viable. So that's the first hardcore scientific evidence which we have allegedly from these skulls. That the mitochondrial DNA from the mother does not match any known base pairs, which once again fits our paradigm that whatever these are not human beings as we know them.
All right, again, LA's done some fantastic research in this regard. I highly recommend you check out his On the Trail of the Nephilim series and his Watcher series and stuff like that. I mean, he's gone down there on several trips to Peru and, you know, and looking at Nephilim mounds and stuff like that all over the world. He, Steve Quayle, Timothy Albarino, if this is new to you, look up these guys, Genesis 6 Productions. They've done a lot of great hands-on, boots on the ground type of research out there, and bringing back photos and hardcore evidence to show what I'm talking about here. So in the video you just saw, I showed this graphic right here where somebody had taken the skull, or a replica of the same skull that I have, and built up the musculature, the external structures onto the skull, and then put fake skin on it, and came to the conclusion that this might have been what she looked like, this particular person. And she's, in height-wise, she's like 5'4" or something like that, 5'6". So comparable in height to a typical normal woman, just with 25% more intellectual capacity, larger brain. And so my speculation, and I've got a chapter in my book called Suspicious Women and the Rise of the X-Men, and talked about this in a number of videos as well, is that could this be what Ham's wife might have looked like? You know, she didn't necessarily have to be a giant. She just has to have corrupted genetic material. You know, something had corrupted her genetics such that she was no longer in the original image that God created, and that perhaps the byproduct of that was a conehead with who knows what other abilities she might have had. You know, what does that size brain, enable a person to do besides perhaps being smarter? Perhaps they had other abilities. And if this doesn't suit your fancy, if you think, I wouldn't want a woman look like that, well, maybe she looks something more like this, right? This is still emulation, right? I mean, you see women that do this beehive hairdo, right? That makes them have a larger looking head, cone head. So I mean, whether they're white or black or whatever skin tone they might have been, it doesn't necessarily mean they had to have been ugly to be a cone head. Maybe they look something like this. Again, this is emulation minus the increased intellectual capacity. Maybe they, this is what they could have looked like.